All day long, the great valley had lain dreamily under the shadows of the Appalachian mountains. In the air, there was a frost, so light it was hardly more than a cold dew, which rested on the late roses, as the south wind shook the leaves from the crimson maples, and over the brightening hills lay a tender purple haze. Summer was dying, but its gentle ghost had come back to the earth, for it was Indian summer, the season that has no name or place in any calendar. The sun had set, and the mist that veiled the horizon had caught its last rays, holding the light lingeringly in its folds, and spreading it far to the north and the south in the soft splendor of color that no other season can show. Not pink, not crimson, but a color as an artist might make if he crushed together on his palette the rose of summer and the leaf of autumn. The chill of the coming night was in the air, but still we lingered on the old front porch, Granny Tollett and I, with our faces pointed towards the west. "I wonder how many folks are watching this sunset," she remarked at last. "Old Joe Matthews, after he got converted at the big revival back yonder in the 30s, used to look for the second coming of the Lord. At every sunset and sunrise, he'd be standing there looking at the sky and say, 'Maybe the King of Glory is at hand.' And once the old man declared that he saw a chariot in the clouds. And I tell you, it does look to me, child, that something ought to happen after a beautiful sight like this." Sighing heavily, she rose from her rocker, and we stepped inside, where the unkindled fire laid ready for the evening hours. The fireplace was filled with brush that we had cleared that day from the flower beds, dry stems that had once borne the verdure and bloom of spring. They now laid in a funeral pyre, ready to be translated by the chariot of fire into the elemental air and earth from whence they had sprung. Granny Tollett struck a match under the old mantle, and stooping down, she touched the dead mass with a finger of flame. "The first fires of autumn. I tell you right now, J.D., there's more than light and heat in their radiance." But as I watched the flames leap into the gloom of the old chimney, I glanced up to the mantel and saw the dusty, unopened bottle of whiskey that had sat on its perch for as long as I could remember. And just then, Granny Tollett, too, looked with absent eyes at the fire that she had just kindled. "Yes, child," she said, as if she knew my exact thoughts. "That old bottle's been there for as long as I can remember." "But, Granny, I don't ever remember Papaw Coy drinking whiskey," I asked in surprise. "Law, no, child," said Granny judiciously. "Your Papaw Coy never touched the stuff. But after Sam Amos quit drinking, your Papaw put that bottle up there as a reminder." "Was Sam Amos a drunk?" "Well, now, a drunkard, according to my notion, is a man that's born with whiskey in his veins. He's predestined to drink, you might say. But Sam never was that sort of man. But once upon a time in his life, it looked mightily like he was going to be a drunk. You see, Sam came from a sober family, and there were nary a reason for him to take to the bottle. But Dr. Pendleton used to say that there was a wild streak in nearly every person, and sooner or later it was bound to break out in one way or the other. And it was that wild streak in Brother Wilson, I reckon, that sent him to the army before he went to preaching. And that same wild streak that put it into Sam's mind to drink whiskey, even though his father and his grandfather had never touched the stuff. Now, just how it all started, well, I can't say, but I reckon that new bar in town must have been the beginning of it. I can recollect the time when it was first opened in town. You see, they had sort of a debating society back in that day. A lyceum, they called it. But Sam Amos, well, he called it the Jawing Club. Dr. Bingham and Judge Grace and Judge Elroy and Colonel Walker and all the big men in town would go down there and sit in it. and they would meet and argue about everything that was done in town or in the state. One question they had brought up was whether the Republicans or the Democrats had the best party, and they argued to pert near 1 o'clock in the morning, and the meeting came mightily near to breaking out into a fight. Well, when the bar got its license, they had a debate about that too. And Dr. Bingham, well, he was in favor of the license, and he got up all easy like to make a speech, and he said, "Fellas, what would the great state of Tennessee be without whiskey?" But Judge Grace, oh, he was clean against it, and he jumped up and shook his fist at the doctor. Well, I reckon it'd be a heap more peaceable place than it is with it, and that made the doctor mad. But he went on like he hadn't heard it. "You just shut your eyes and say the word Tennessee, and what do you see? Why, you see a glass of Jack Daniels and a pretty woman smiling over it." But just then, Judge Grace hollered out, "No, you don't. You may see that poison in the glass, but that woman won't be smiling. She'll be crying her eyes out over that stuff. It's ruined the lives of many otherwise good men." Well, they argued up and down and back and forth, and finally the friends had to get a hold of them and keep them from coming to blows. But as I was saying, that bar was the beginning of Sam Amos's troubles, and Miley's too. You see, the bar was a sociable sort of place, and Sam, well, he was a sociable sort of fella, and it was just as natural for him to go in there and see his friends and talk with them, and the first thing we knew, he was drinking with them. Not much, but enough to unsettle his brain and make him talk wild and act foolish. And before you knew it, he was following that same old beaten path that men have been walking since the days of Noah. And at last he got to neglecting his farm, and he would go to town every week and come home in such a condition that it wasn't safe for Miley and the children to be in the same house with him. Folks used to say that the first drink made Sam a fool, and the second drink made him the devil, and the third drink, why, it put the fool and the devil both to sleep. Well, Sam was just as smart a man as you'd find anywhere, if only he'd stopped at that first glass that made a fool of him. His drinking would have been just a small matter. But I tell you this for certain, the man that can stop at one glass, well, he don't live in Tennessee, child. And so Sam went from the first glass to the second, and from the second to the third, and from the third to the gutter. I recollect one county court day, me and your Papa Coy happened to be passing along in front of the old Methodist church, and there he came along, a-leading his bay horse, and that mare was the pride of Sam's heart. He used to say that there was more good blood in that bay mare of his than any 6 families in the state of Tennessee. Now, Sam was a mighty fine judge of horse flesh, and he had gotten his love for horses from his father and his grandpa, old Harrison Amos. And that old man was one of the biggest horse raisers in the state, and they say he made thousands of dollars out of it too. Well, anyhow, that's where Sam got his love for fine horses. And as I was saying, Sam came walking up, leading his bay mare by the bridle, and me and your Papa Coy was on our way to the drugstore, with our yellow house dog following close behind us. And Sam called to us to stop, and he said, "Can we make a trade today? I'll swap you my horse for your dog." And your Papa said, "Well, that's the deal." And he took hold of the mare's bridle, and he pulled out a piece of string out of his pocket, and tied it around the pup's collar, and put the end of the string in Sam's hand. Just then, your Papa looked over at me and said, "Well, I'm going to give Sam a lesson that may shame him out of his drinking habits for a while." And then he led the mare to the stable and told the man to feed and water her, and he'd call for her later that evening. Well, once it was time to go home, we set out to look for Sam, and after looking up and down the square and all down the main street, we finally found him, laying helpless in the back of a grocery store. Well, your Papa got 2 men to help him, and he managed to lift Sam up and put him in the back of the wagon so we could drive over to Sam's farm, 'cause we knew Miley was waiting and grieving. And sure enough, there she was, standing underneath that big sycamore tree in the front of the gate, looking and listening for Sam. She told me afterwards that she had stayed that way a many a nights till her clothes would be plumb wet with the dew, and for the rest of her life, she hated the sound of crickets and katydids because they reminded her of that year when Sam gave her so much trouble. Well, your Papa drove up to the gate, and Miley was too scared to speak. She was always worrying about Sam falling off his horse and breaking his neck. And when she saw your Papa and nobody with him, She thought he was coming home to break the news to her, and Sam's dead body would surely be the next thing to come. But your papa didn't know this, or he'd have told her right at once that Sam was in the wagon. But anyways, when he stopped, Miley was leaning forwards with her hands together and hardly enough breath to speak. And she finally whispered, "Where's Sam?" "Well, he's right here in the wagon." And Miley said, "Thank God. I was afraid he was dead." Now that shows you what kind of a heart Miley had. When a man's brought home dead drunk child, it ain't every woman that'll thank God he's alive. Well, we had some trouble rousing Sam, but at last we got him in the house and took his coat and shoes off and laid him on the bed. And that's when your papa started to leave, and Miley said, "But where's Sam's horse?" "Well, when Sam comes to tomorrow, you send him over to my house, and I'll put him on the trail to his mare." So anyhow, the next morning, about 11 o'clock, here comes Sam, looking as reckless and as miserable as a man ever gets to look. And he said, "I've come for my horse. I see the stable doors open, so you needn't bother yourself. I'll go down there and saddle her up and ride her home. I'm much obliged to you for taking care of her." And your papa replied, "Sam, you might not know it, but that mare belongs to me." And Sam laughed and said, "Well, I reckon I do owe you something for bringing me home last night. But surely you won't take my horse from me." "But Sam, you swapped that horse to me yesterday." "Swapped her? Well, what did I swap her for?" And just then, here came that yellow dog around the corner of the house just a wagging his tail. And your papa Coy pointed to him and said, "You swapped your horse for that dog, Sam." Well, I tell you, for a minute, Sam was so thunderstruck he couldn't say another word. When finally he got the nerve. "Do you mean to say that I was such a fool yesterday that I swapped the finest piece of horse flesh in the state for that old yeller dog, with me being the best judge of horses in Roane County?" "Oh, yes, sir. You did that very thing, Sam. And the swap was your own proposing." Well, I tell you, Sam sat down on the doorstep and he folded his arms over his knees and dropped his head on his arms. And he cursed himself and he cursed the whiskey. And he finally said, "Well, I swear, I'll never touch another drop of that cursed stuff. And all the devils in hell can't make me break my oath." "Well, Sam, I wanted to hear you make that promise, and that's why I kept your horse. Now, go in the stable, and you'll find her, all safe and sound, and the saddle and the bridle is on the right-hand side of the door. And Sam, may God give you grace to keep you from ever making such a fool of yourself again." But child, it wasn't a month before Sam was hauled home again in the back of a wagon. I remember it was late one Monday night. He was so drunk that he hit Miley, and he kicked her and the kids out of the house. And the next thing we heard was that Miley's father had come to take her back home. Miley told me about it long after the trouble was over. She said she'd been hoping that the bruise on her cheek would be well before her pa saw her. And she'd been putting cold and hot water and everything else she could think of to draw the blood out of it. But once somebody told the old man how bad things had been going for Miley, it wasn't 2 hours till he was there to move Miley back home. Miley said Sam was sitting by the table with his head down on his arms as she was washing up the dinner dishes, with her face bound up in one of Sam's handkerchiefs. And that's when the old man came in. Oh, I tell you, his lips and his hands were both trembling, and he said, "Miley, put your things together as quick as you can. I've come to take you back home. I ain't no advocate of married folks separating, but when Sam took you from my house, he promised to be good and kind to you, and he's broke his promise, and you got no business staying with him any longer." And Miley, before she could even answer him, he yelled out, "Hurry up and get your stuff ready. Ain't no child of mine gonna be with a drunk that lays violent hands on his wife." Well, I reckon the old man thought he was saying exactly the right thing, and that Miley would thank him for taking her part. But just then, Miley finally spoke up. "Pa, and I know drinking whiskey is bad enough, but it ain't the worst thing a man can do. And it's not what a man does when he's drunk that makes a woman hate him and leave him. It's what he does when he's sober. And you know, when Sam's himself, there ain't a kinder, better husband anywhere." Miley said Sam gave a gasp and looked up at her as if he couldn't believe his ears. And then he burst out a-crying and fell on his knees and threw his arms around her and held on tight like a drowning man trying to save himself. And he said, "Miley, I've asked God to help me, and he didn't seem to care. But if you'll stay with me, Miley, I promise I'll quit, and I'll never lay my hands on you again." Well, Miley's father just stood there, looking at pathetic Sam. And I tell you right now, had it not been for how much Miley loved him, her pa would have probably killed him that day. And it took everything the old man had in him not to do it. But he promised Sam that there wouldn't be a next time. And he got in his wagon and he drove off. Well, Miley said that all that day, Sam stayed around the house, following her around like a dog following its master. And every now and then he'd say, "I've got to quit, Miley. I promise I'm going to quit." But Miley, she had heard him break that promise so often that she didn't have one bit of faith that he'd keep it now. Well, the very next Monday was county court day, and all day Sunday, Miley told me she was praying that Sam wouldn't go to town. But right after supper, Sam said, "Honey, I'm going to town tomorrow, and I'm taking you and the young'uns with me. We'll get an early start." Miley said she couldn't sleep that night, and she prayed that it might pour down rain or something would happen to keep Sam at home. The sun came up clear, and there was nothing to do but to dress and go to town with Sam. She said Sam took particular pains with himself. He put on his Sunday clothes and shaved and combed and brushed his hair till he looked more like his old self than he had ever looked since he took to drinking. She said the road to town had never seemed so short, and she kept hoping that something would happen to send Sam back home. But nothing did. And as soon as they got to the square, Sam went straight down the main street right in the direction of that bar. Miley said her heart gave a jump, and she shook all over like she was having a chill. But she didn't say a word, because she knew if Sam had made up his mind to drink that day, there was no way she could stop him. And sure enough, he went right on in and stood right in front of the bar, and the bartender was standing at the door, and Sam called out to him and said, "Fix me up a glass of that old bourbon, just the way I like it, and bring it out here to me." And the barkeeper went in and fixed it up and came right on out, smiling like a basket of chips, and he handed it to Sam. No sooner than Sam handed over the money for the drink, he held the glass up and looked at it, and he put his face down and smelt it, and then he put his lips like he was going to drink it, and then all at once, he turned to Miley and said, "Look here, Miley." And then he dashed it down into the gutter, and the glass broke into 100 pieces, and that whiskey splattered all over the horse's hooves and the barkeeper's shoes. Miley said Sam was as white as a ghost and shaking as hard as she was. And he nodded to the barkeeper and said, "Well, that's my last drink." And just like that, he turned around and drove up towards the square. Miley was so thankful that he hadn't touched that whiskey that she began crying for joy. But truth be told, she still didn't know whether that was his last drink or not. He had broken so many promises to her before, and Sam seemed to know what was on her mind. And he said, "Miley, do you believe me or not?" All at once, she thought of that scripture that said, "For by grace are ye saved through faith." And she thought of Sam, the day her pa had come to take her home, and how he kept saying to keep on believing in him, and that her faith would save him. Just then, she laid her hand on Sam's knee and she said, "Yes, Sam, I believe in you." And child, the moment she spoke that word, she said it looked like a stone rolled away from her heart, and she felt in her soul that she had come to the end of her trouble, and the world appeared to be made all over new again. When they got to the square, Sam handed her a roll of bills and said, "Now, baby, go in there and buy yourself and the children some Christmas gifts while I go get the groceries we need, and we'll meet up at the drugstore and go home whenever you're ready." Well, Miley took the money and she bought the things for the children. But when she began to look in the windows and the showcases for something for herself, she couldn't see a single thing that would make her any happier than she was. So she put the rest of the money in the waist of her dress, and when Sam met her in front of the drugstore, she handed it back to him. and said, "I've bought the children some things, but there's no use wasting your money. on a woman who's got everything on earth that she wants. So she wouldn't let Sam buy her a thing that Christmas, and yet Miley felt like she owned the entire earth. And honey, when Sam dashed out that glass of whiskey on the ground and said it was his last drink, he told the truth. And if he'd been the chief of sinners, there couldn't have been more rejoicing over him. As time went by, and everybody in Roane County began to feel sure that he had quit for good, Parson Page said something to him one day about the grace of God saving him. And Sam shook his head and said, "No, Parson, I'm certain that God's too honest to want credit that don't belong to him. And in the matter of me quitting the drink, it wasn't the grace of God that stopped me. It was the grace of my wife." And Dr. Pendleton was standing nearby, and he said, "Yep, all Sam needed was a great moral uplift. But in a case like his, there's nothing better than the love of a woman." I never got through wondering over the way Miley bore with Sam in the days he was walking the downward path, and it looked like nothing could stop him. Human nature is a curious thing, child. You may think you know someone so well that you can tell exactly what he'll do, but many and many times in my life, I've found myself mistaken about folks that I'd known all my life. And it was that way with Miley. Miley was high-tempered and quick-spoken, and if anybody had asked me how Miley would act if Sam took to drinking, I'd have said it once, "Well, she'll leave him quick." But she didn't. She was as patient with him as any mother ever was with her son. She'd put him to bed and wait on him, and when he'd come to himself, she'd never say a word about what had happened. And I reckon it was her grace that saved him. And it's a curious thing, child, how two people will live together for years and years and never know how much they love each other. But I reckon it's that way with most married folks. They jog along together. They have their ups and downs, and there may be many a time that they think they don't love each other, just like they did when they were first married. But just let a little trouble come up, child, and they'll find all the love they used to have is there, and more. Why, I recollect Parson Page saying once that love and money was just alike in one respect. They'll both draw interest, and I reckon many a married couple's richer than they think they are. Just then, Granny Tollet pushed her spectacles back upon her forehead and folded her hands and leaned back in her chair, lost in the reverie that generally followed the telling of a story, while I gazed at the firelight and felt the cord of human sympathy drawing me nearer to the people of her day and time. For during my childhood, there was no greater storyteller than Granny Tollet.